What's going on, guys? You put it to a vote, and this is the result. We will be discussing the book of Revelation and the end of days in light of recent escalation in the Middle East. From what I've heard, the most recent strike seems pretty surgical. Trump hit some top secret Iranian nuclear facilities. It doesn't seem that there were any civilian casualties, from what I've heard, or minimal civilian casualties at least. Iran appears to be saying the damage is minimal. So, on the one hand, it is a very frightening escalation of the situation. But then on the other, it still falls short of like an overt declaration of war. Depends on how you want to interpret it. So, anyway, from first, I want to voice my skepticism that having knowledge of information about what the book of Revelation even really means. I don't really believe that having that knowledge has that much utility in and of itself. Like, I really don't think knowing how the world's going to end should affect your actions that much one way or the other, and that you should be living your life confidently and authentically, striving to be your best self and fulfill the will of God in your life, blah, blah, blah. Secondly, I want to point out that any answer I give will inherently be informed by theology. So people have a lot of different perspectives about the timeline of events in this book, and that's what's known as eschatology, the progression of events of the end of the world. This view has not been uniform throughout Christian history, and the book of Revelation has often very justifiably been viewed with great skepticism throughout the centuries. Um, I don't know about you guys, but I grew up with the cultural belief that people who studied it too closely could sometimes go insane as a result. So the only reason I'm speculating on it now is because it's thematically appropriate, and with our current political situation, it seems dire enough that probably worth discussing. Um, People think they can use, one of the things that kind of drives people crazy too is people think they can use the day year principle and timetable out the exact date of the end of the world. And that's led to like multiple disasters, like the Great Disappointment. I think this is how the Jehovah's Witnesses got started. They used to be part of this movement called the Millerites, and they were really, really certain that the world was about to end in their era. And people were climbing onto the tops of mountains because they thought the rapture was about to happen, um, and then it didn't happen. And the Jehovah's Witness religion, I think, emerged as a reaction by some of the people in the movement. Um, anyway, also, anytime someone tries to tell me how Revelation is supposed to go, I usually just tune them out. It's usually some sensationalized evangelical Baptist action movie fantasy sort of vision. And I just can't take most premillennial views on Revelation seriously for that reason. But on the other hand, just because an interpretation is new doesn't make it wrong inherently. But I do think most people are historically ignorant as to when and where their ideas about revelation actually came from. For any non believers watching, Abrahamic religions could be understood as a sort of hyperstition, like a series of ideas that actively shape reality. So, whether or not any of this has to happen in a determinative sense isn't necessarily as relevant as the fact that these ideas may simply cause people to act them out. And that's why their development and impact is significant. But, anyways, let's dive into some of the historical context regarding certain ideas based on the book of Revelation. Now, initially, all the Protestant reformers were united in their eschatology. Martin Luther, John Calvin, John Knox, John Wesley all were in agreement that the office of the papacy was the Antichrist. That is the historical Protestant postmillennial view. Some of the first preterist and premillennial eschatological systems were developed by Jesuits in order to deflect attention from this accusation during the Reformation period. So, when the Reformation was happening, the Protestant reformers finally, who I guess were sort of like rogue scholars paid by various German nobles, interpreted the book of Revelation through fresh eyes and realized that the papacy was the Antichrist. Um, this is another way of me pointing out that the book of Revelation has always had inherently political implications and has been used for political agendas. And this should be taken into consideration whenever it's discussed. Another important thing to consider is that what seems to be the current dominant premillennial view in American Christianity is like a modified version of a premillennial system developed by the Puritans in what I believe was the 1600s or so. It was adapted and popularized in America by John Nelson Darby in the 1900s. So, premillennialism has undergone a progressive series of elaborations and mutations more so than perhaps any other theological position regarding eschatology. Um, if you're a preterist, the book of Revelation would have basically no bearing on today's events because essentially all of its contents have already happened. So I don't think we have to dwell much on the implications of preterist eschatology because generally speaking, it really wouldn't be able to point us in one direction or another as to the spiritual significance of current events. In other words, if Revelation has already happened, today's events would fall outside the scope of prophecy uh, if you think the book of Revelation all already happened anyways. Personally, I incline towards historical postmillennialism because, on the one hand, Revelation is kind of pointless as a book if all of it already happened in the preterist view. But then it also equally makes no sense for early Christians to receive a book that's completely unintelligible in the premillennial futurist view. The coming on the clouds is not the second coming, in my opinion, but rather Jesus ascending to the right hand of the Father in heaven. So postmillennialism becomes the last strong contender for coherency, in my opinion. This means the book of Revelation begins immediately at the end of the events of the New Testament and then spans all the way over the course of the 2,000 years since then until today. The problem with postmillennialism, though, is then identifying which historical events correspond to what symbolic events mentioned in the Bible. And there's essentially no authoritative or perfectly consistent way to do that. You can't have an angel act as a third party independent fact checker, fly down from heaven, and verify that this is what all this means. Human history also doesn't seem like there's been much of a golden age either, which is another feature of postmillennial theology. Um, Though I suppose Christ reigning in judgment over the world for the past 2,000 years at the right hand of the Father could be a sort of golden age if things aren't always so great for us here on earth, even if things aren't always so great for us here on earth. Um, in a premillennial view, the Bible is essentially silent on human history for the past 2,000 years. But, however, it really does seem like Revelation is describing a single future world government. Like, this is just something that intuitively seems true to me. You know, I bet we've all at least at one time had that vision of a world despotism reigned over by an archfiend who receives prophecy and orders directly from the devil. The description of the actual reign of the Antichrist in the Bible seems short and pretty contentious, though. Like, whoever this person is, if they are a future person, it seems like they're on the receiving end of massive resistance by these individuals called the Seven Kings who rule the seven kingdoms of the earth. Um, and Revelation also indicates that the actual reign of the Antichrist is fairly short. So, in a premillennial view, these kings would not necessarily be good people, but from what I see in Revelation, everything seems to fall short of some sort of, like, I don't know, woke totalitarian state or global communism or something like that. The actual vision of the dystopian you'll own nothing and be happy society doesn't seem to last very long if we're to interpret that as the ultimate evil world spanning system described in Revelation. Um, I'm also skeptical of the idea that the mark of the beast was a certain medical procedure because it seems very apparent to me that the mark of the beast is a reference to a spiritual mark on the forehead and hand, not a literal thing. It symbolizes obedience to God generally in thought and in deed, forehead, hand. So that's the symbolism of the mark of the beast. It's a spiritual mark about people who actually are in tune, acting in line with the will of God. Another observation about the situation that I've had is that traditional religious structures in the Middle East are being totally destroyed. I can imagine the Shiite clergy would be totally dismantled if the U.S. goes to war with and then occupies Iran. And an invasion and occupation of Iran is now a method by which liberal democracy could be extended across the entire Middle East. Um, and also you've seen things like the Shah of Iran making conspicuous appearances. It really seems like some aspects of the government are hinting at some sort of color revolution that the U.S. backs. The Iranian government is fairly unstable and has a lot of uh, dissenters still. Invading and occupying Iran will likely cause a massive reactionary backlash among Muslims, potentially ushering a new era of terrorism, in my opinion. Um, Sunni and Shiite Muslims would be united again, and they may quickly overcome any sort of fratricidal impulses they have. Uh, ISIS, for instance, has apparently been observed. There's a slight uptick in their activity again. They're rearing their ugly head. But and to be clear, like ISIS's theology is incompatible with the theology of Iran and Pakistan. So, but they might all sort of join forces in some sort of weird Muslim Power Ranger. Now that now that they've been confronted with this great historical challenge. With geopolitical tensions this high, other countries could become involved, and armies may end up surrounding Israel. From a premillennial perspective, one could interpret China and Russia as Gog and Magog going against Israel. Here is the map of someone in my Discord, General Jack Ripper. This is his prediction for how World War III may unfold. I don't know. I don't think Vietnam will join the Sinosphere. I think they like America too much. But here is the map for your viewing pleasure. Uh, on another note, China could see this whole escalation in the Middle East, if we do get directly involved, as an opportunity to strike Taiwan. It would be a decent window of opportunity on their part, though I think a move like this would be uncharacteristically aggressive of them. So I'm not sure that if there were actually boots on the ground in Iran, China might act on that. But it would be kind of a nice time to make that move if they're going to make it. You know what I mean? Um, from a neoliberal or neoconservative perspective, if this situation escalates all the way, the Middle East will just need to be liberated and transformed into a bunch of Western style democracies or sleek Gulf state petro autocracies. They can all be like little versions of Singapore. They can keep their Islamic religion walled up like little versions of Singapore, aesthetic and still amenable to Western liberal universalism. But if you actually set foot in one of those countries, they will throw you in a prison for 9 years for spitting publicly on the street. All right, all right, all right. Brief interlude for viewer engagement questions. All right, now's the part where I ask all 10 of you who are still watching some questions to make sure you're actually all still watching. Is the U.S. capable of westernizing the Middle East? What level of force do you think is necessary to reshape what remains of Islamic civilization? Is the prospect of Iranian women showing off their beach bodies again, like back in the 70s, a silver lining for you? You'll be able to check them out under Rock Beach if you haven't already been blinded by nuclear ash and or chemical agents. Because remember, the future is so bright you will not be needing eyes to see it. All right, hit the comments with your answers and back to your regularly scheduled programming. One can imagine that in occupied Middle Eastern countries, some Western strategists might seek to promote liberal versions of Islam, which are currently marginal, in order to make the populations of these countries more amenable to Western norms and values. One example might be certain strains of Sufism. But one of the challenges is that it's not easy in the current landscape to construct a meta narrative or shared story for the Islamic world that isn't essentially anti Zionist and anti Western. Whether it's Gaddafi or Saddam or Assad on that pan Arabist wave, or Al Qaeda, Hamas, or ISIS, there are no Arab political movements that are friendly to the West unless they're Western backed puppet movements. To me, now does still seem like prime time for a death grapple to establish a final world order. It's pretty easy to envision the progress of global technocratic planning in a liberal democratic framework should Western powers prove victorious, especially if this does escalate into like a World War III scenario and then we end up clobbering Russia and China. Um, Outside the American political class, I don't see a whole lot of support for escalation with Iran. There's people who will defend Trump no matter what he does, but it also seems like the left doesn't really have a unified narrative one way or the other as to whether or not Trump's actions, like with this most recent strike, are a good or bad move on his part. There are still tons of people who are sympathetic to Israel who vote Democrat, and obviously their wing of the American political class is just as intent on Western power projection in the Middle East as the neocons are. I mean, as a funny aside, you can see Nikki Haley angling to be the anti-war candidate with an apparently anti-war tweet like this. Um, but even if this is a massive, devastating hit to Trump's credibility, there may be some challenges for the left to properly exploit it to their advantage, given the U.S.'s relationship with Israel. I'm not really sure what the point of the whole elaborate, awful globalist trade relationship with China was, if what's going on right now was a foregone conclusion the whole time, right? Like, why would globalists build a massive trade network with China if we were just going to, dive into Middle East chaos anyways, inevitably? Um, I think we'll need to pay very close attention to Trump's actions and words in the coming days to get more insight into where the situation is headed. Um, as mentioned earlier, we've struck 3 Iranian nuclear sites, top secret nuclear sites, which is a massive escalation, but still shy of war. And I'll remind you, we also drone struck one of their top generals before, and they basically did nothing. Um, as people on the internet say, nothing ever happens. Iran really may be too anemic to mount any kind of counteroffensive beyond what we've already seen for the time being. That's a legitimate possibility. Uh, I'm not saying it's the case, but it's still something to consider. And it may be a legitimate question as to whether or not Iran is all that capable of escalating very far beyond this. It was already a fairly unstable country, and the Iranian government fielding an army to march on Israel is very different from American soldiers going through every room and every building in Tehran, slicing the pie, fighting military insurgents. You know, these are two very different situations. So Iran could be basically like militarily defeated in the sense that they can't bring the fight to us, but us bringing the fight to them would still be quite the quagmire, in my opinion. Um, a false flag could also be easily manufactured to justify further American involvement. So Iran being too weak doesn't necessarily rule anything out, but that those are just my thoughts. And now for the third act of this video. Is this the end of the world? Probably not, in my opinion. I don't know. Could be, though. I was actually surprised to learn that over 50% of fighting aged men in France, England, Germany, Italy, and Russia survived World War II. I thought it really killed over half of all men for that whole generation, but apparently the odds weren't necessarily even that bad. So, I mean, what do you think your odds are if you get drafted? Do you think you'll live through it? Are you optimistic? Do you think you could just like juke and like dodge bullets, be like Neo or something? I don't know. Um, Also, just sort of checking in on people's moods. Someone was like, "Oh, because I was talking about, I put up the poll, and someone was like, "Oh, I think you should go have a nice meal instead of like making this video or something." And I was like, "One, do you know how far away Red Robin is? I'm not driving 45 minutes to get a Royal Burger. I really want to go to Carl's Jr. and Hardee's. Carl's Jr. and Hardee's is where it's at, but they don't have one in my state." Anyway, I pretty much made my peace with God, and I enjoy talking smack on the internet. So no, there really isn't a better way for me to be wasting my time right now before the world ends. And I'm not moralizing here, but I think if you're really spending your time how you should, you won't be as afraid to die. You'll look back on your life and you won't have regrets. So for me personally, more than anything, Revelation is a reminder that we don't know when. I could get drafted and die during this conflict, or suffer some freak accident in basic training after getting drafted, or just get struck by a car tomorrow walking around the neighborhood. You know, I know not where or when, only the Lord knows. Um, and it's easy to like just have apocalyptic visions of collapsing in the mud of a trench, breathing in a neurotoxin that makes you void your bowels and causes every muscle in your body to clench. It's that could be your future. Maybe not. Don't stress. Just live in the moment, I guess. So, to wax philosophical towards the end of the video, to paraphrase a little bit of Hegel's philosophy of history, history is and always has been the material and intellectual contributions of different nations to world civilization, as well as the struggle of different nations for world domination. History is also the scene of conflict, disasters, and wars, a slaughter bench, and not a theater of happiness. Um, I'm reminded of the scripture, the days of a man's life are like war. And I know it's true that hardship is a defining aspect of the human experience. And that's kind of easier said than done. It's something I can sort of recognize intellectually. But when I get drafted, I'm probably going to be crying in the barracks, just wanting some tendies or something. Uh, but that is kind of, I don't know. That's my view of the harsh truth of the world. On the other hand, if I get drafted and live, and I come back, I'm really gonna enjoy lecturing young people of the future about things I saw at war. I can already tell that's the kind of old guy I'll be should history unfold in this particular manner. Anyway, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was thought provoking. I hope it wasn't boring. I hope you found some of it insightful, interesting, engaging, whatever perspective you come from. Are you not entertained? And of course, red channels will catch you in the next one.